a wall of brown dust rolls over the Oklahoma prairie like a living tide, swallowing the town of Cimarron in seconds. The sky, once a bright summer blue, turns an angry, choking gray as the wind howls through the skeletal remains of once fertile fields. How did a nation's ambition to grow wheat turn the Great Plains into a battlefield of sand and sky? It is 1934, and the Great Plains are already scarred by years of drought. Farmers, urged by the promise of high wheat prices after World War I, have plowed the native grasses that once held the soil in place. The deep-rooted prairie sod, a living anchor that survived centuries of wind and fire, is gone, replaced by rows of thin-stalked wheat that die back each summer, leaving the earth exposed. Beat 1, the promise of plenty. In the early 1920s, the federal government, private lenders, and a booming post-war market poured credit into the plains. The original Homestead Act of 1862 and the later enlarged Homestead Act of 1909 encouraged families to claim 3 20-acre parcels, and the 1920s saw a surge of new farms because wheat fetched premium prices in Europe. At that time there was no soil conservation service. The prevailing wisdom, echoed in agricultural extension bulletins, held that the soil could be endlessly tilled. A typical family, father, mother, and children, packed a modest horse-drawn wagon with seed, a plow, and a handful of hopes. The scent of freshly turned earth mingled with the dry prairie grass, and the rhythm of planting became a seasonal drumbeat that echoed from North Dakota to Texas. Beat 2, the drying of the land. By 1930, the rains that had sustained the region for decades began to falter. The first dry year was dismissed as a blip, the next as a setback, and the third as a trend. Well water levels fell, and the once blue streams of the Arkansas and Canadian rivers cracked into muddy channels. Yet wheat continued to be sown because the market still offered a premium for grain, and federal programs such as the Agricultural Credits Act of 1923 made loans readily available. Farmers were not simply greedy, they were responding to a complex web of incentives, insurance schemes, and a cultural narrative that equated endless cultivation with progress. Contemporary newspapers praised the heroic farmer who wrestles the prairie into a sea of gold. Beat 3, the black blizzards arrive. In the spring of 1934, a high-pressure ridge over the Rockies forced a cold front eastward. The wind, funneled across the flat expanse, reached speeds that could lift a sack of grain and hurl it miles away. Without the deep roots of native grasses, the topsoil was nothing more than fine dust. When the first black blizzard hit, it was as if a curtain of night had dropped over the day. Some residents later recalled the sky as a black river of dust, a description that appears in later recollections and has taken on a legendary quality. The storm lasted for hours, covering roads, choking livestock, and forcing families to seal their doors with wet cloths. The dust settled in homes like a fine powder, coating furniture, books, and even the faces of children who slept on the floor. Estimates suggest that the 1934 storm that swept through Cimarron and surrounding counties deposited several inches of dust in a single day, though exact measurements vary. Beat 4, the human toll. The blizzards were not just a visual spectacle, they were a health crisis. Doctors in towns such as Lubbock and Amarillo reported a surge in dust pneumonia, a condition caused by inhaling fine particles that inflamed the lungs. Schools closed, and children missed weeks of education, their eyes burning from the gritty air. The economic impact was immediate. Crops were buried, machinery clogged, and the already scarce market for wheat plummeted as buyers balked at grain that looked as though it had been filtered through a sandstorm. Contemporary reports note that farm incomes in the hardest-hit counties fell by as much as half during the peak of the dust storms. The turn, the soil conservation revelation. By late 1935, a group of agronomists, including Dr. Hugh Hammond Bennett of the newly formed Soil Conservation Service, SCS, presented a stark report: the loss of native prairie grasses was the primary cause of the dust storms. Their field observation showed that plots where a few acres of native grasses remained suffered far less erosion than neighboring wheat fields. The report argued that the soil, once held together by a network of roots, could only be stabilized again by replanting deep-rooted species and by adopting contour plowing, strip fallow, and terracing techniques. This scientific assessment forced a dramatic shift in policy. The SCS, created in 1935 as part of the New Deal, began to work with farmers, offering technical assistance and, crucially, financial incentives such as the Emergency Farm Relief Act of 1933, which paid families to adopt conservation practices. The turn reframes the disaster not as an inevitable natural catastrophe but as a preventable outcome of human choices. Beat 5, the slow recovery ***. With the new practices, some fields began to show signs of improvement within a few seasons. Shelter belts, rows of trees such as eastern red cedar and black locust, were planted along the edges of farms, their leaves rustling like a quiet promise against the howling gusts. The Civilian Conservation Corps (CCC) crews planted over 30 million trees across the plains, creating living windbreaks that reduced wind speed by up to 60% in some locales. Farmers who once relied on a single cash crop diversified, planting legumes, sorghum, and native grasses that restored nitrogen to the soil. By 1940, the frequency and intensity of black blizzards had declined markedly, though occasional dust storms still occurred during dry spells. Contemporary weather records show that the number of dust storms exceeding 3 hours fell from an average of about a dozen per year in the early 1930s to fewer than 4 by the mid-1940s. Beat 6, the legacy that lingers ***. Decades later, the dust that once choked towns can still be found in sediment layers of the region, a geological record of human hubris. Modern climate scientists study those layers to understand how land use can amplify extreme weather. The Dust Bowl also left a cultural imprint, photographs by Dorothea Lange, songs like Woody Guthrie's Dust Bowl Blues, and novels such as John Steinbeck's ***The Grapes of Wrath** capture the desperation of families forced to leave their homes in search of work. Yet, even today, parts of the plains face similar pressures: intensive agriculture, recurring drought, and a warming climate, raising the question of whether the lessons of the 1930s are being heeded. Recent studies suggest that while conservation tillage and cover cropping have reduced soil loss, large-scale monoculture and groundwater depletion continue to threaten the region's resilience. The haunting question remains: as we confront a new era of climate extremes, will the scars of the black blizzard serve as a warning, or will the lure of short-term profit once again outweigh the long-term health of the land? The wind still sweeps across the prairie, and the dust still whispers of a time when the ground itself rose up in revolt. In the silence after the storm, the prairie holds its breath, waiting to see if humanity will finally listen.